Hello everyone, today we read and comment on the 32nd paragraph of the second chapter of the second book of von Clausewitz, Vom Kriege, the title being Time of the Day. The text follows. The time of day influences the combat by the difference between day and night, but the influence naturally extends further than merely to the limits of these divisions, as every combat has a certain duration and great battles last for several hours. In the preparations for a great battle, it makes an essential difference whether it begins in the morning or in the evening. At the same time, certainly many battles may be fought in which the question of time of day is quite immaterial, and in the generality of cases its influence is only trifling. So this is a fairly simple paragraph, but it contains interesting observations about how the time of the day proper, that is not tied strictly to the atmosphere as such, or other elements like including the place, right? But just about the time of the day abstracted from other factors. Always bear in mind that von Clausewitz here is tracing a strictly theoretical differentiation in the theory of the art of war to make you observe how essentially these individual factors alone actually determine a freaking deal of things. These first three ones, locality, time of day, and weather, being constantly influencing the situation no matter what, right? Because there are others that can appear, disappear, while these ones are omnipresent, let's say. So the theoretical distinction that is made in these three paragraphs is not to say that these factors should be considered like separately speaking in reality, right? But just in theory, to make you understand how individually they can change a lot, in different measures, of course, but that they are, however, always there. So no matter what, you have to take them into consideration. So von Clausewitz writes, the time of day influences the combat by the difference between day and night. So this is pretty obvious, right? And it's not just about that. It's really also about what these impacts in terms of environmentally speaking, like objectively, the difference between day and night is about the light chiefly, but not only, because essentially our organisms kind of tend to function in different ways that in these times of the day that naturally can be radically modified in the sense depending on under how much pressure you are, whether you've eaten or not, whether whatever your moral force is. So obviously the organism does adapt, and human organism has a great capacity of adaptation, but still makes a difference. Banally, from a psychological point of view, where there is light and people are kind of more confident, they can see better, so they're gonna behave in a certain way accordingly. At night, tendentially, you are more suspicious. You're somewhat scared by a certain degree about what is around you, because chiefly you can't see well through it. So you have this primordial feel that things can go worse and much more quickly, right? Worse during night than during the day. So as I was saying before, this has nothing to do with the weather. Right, you can have kind of a bright night with a beautiful moon, full moon that kind of lightens the certain areas. You can have a terrible day that maybe it looks like night for how dark it is. But in general, we understand how the average is instead pretty well distinguished and distinguishable, of course, and the thing does make an influence by itself, right? And von Clausewitz writes, but the influence naturally extends further than merely to the limits of these divisions, as every combat has a certain duration and great battles last for several hours, right? So the difference here is naturally relative. This is what von Clausewitz is making us understand. I mean, it depends. For example, now we've made the example of the individual psyche and how it reacts during the day and during the night to certain things. But this naturally has to be considered also in broader terms. That is, here, for example, the one brought up by von Clausewitz, great battles, right? The great battles that indeed require a much more thorough planning and organization and predisposition that at that point has to take into consideration how long, for example, the battle is going to last, and in that sense, in which time of the day is it going to extend, right? Battles last for a very long time, normally, and several hours is, we can't kind of draw, historically speaking, a line saying, there were times in which battles were kind of shorter, right? It's obvious that in certain modern contexts, for example, if you have night goggles and you can look through like infrared rays, you in the darkness, it's you can theoretically extend by a certain degree, how long you can fight in that situation, but individually it's virtually an influent factor, in the sense that, of course, that is subordinated only to very peculiar availability of material and, I don't know, the batteries of the goggles, or maybe many other things that actually do not change much, also in terms of day and night difficulties at that point, and that considering the whole spectrum of the battle, they are going to constitute basically such just in fact a virtually influent factor on the duration of combat as such. So we can't say that, I don't know, since we didn't have infrareds in 2000 years ago, then people back then fought less at night that we do today. It's actually not true. It's obvious that big engagements, even today, are actually slowed down, at least, or they tend to die out during the night, just like in the past. Just as today is in the dawn of times of warfare, people fight at night, and they do it kind of on a regular basis. Actually, night fight in military history is very important. It has a great significance in certain circumstances, and that is influenced because of night proper. So that's here what von Clausewitz is really making us reflect on. These are simple examples. Von Clausewitz here is not teaching us what is to fight at night properly, simply stating the obvious, that is, bear in mind that these factors by themselves have an impact, right? So the point is, rather, instead of showing you what you should do, because that in fact can vary dramatically in every single circumstance, what we can do is to be aware that that thing is going to happen, right? And this is not even, we've said it many times when commenting von Clausewitz, that here von Clausewitz is not even trying to say that this is what should be done. He's literally saying this is what happens, right? Because combat functions that way. It's not that you need to know that night has an effect on you to behave accordingly because it's night. War is going to evolve. The combat is going to change in a certain direction by certain variables, because no matter what, right? Because it's gonna get dark. It's the sun is gonna rise again. So that exists and has to be taken into account, right? And obviously, trying to foresee what happens beyond the immediate, right, which is kind of important here, because it's obvious that if every circumstance is different, and therefore von Clausewitz rightfully stresses the fact that you should check in every single moment what is going on, but this doesn't exclude at all the fact that you have to think on the long run, when you know that these factors are constantly going to interfere in warfare, right? Unless the world ends, there is day and night at that point. So it's you can't exclude that, and you have to already reason by knowing that when that that light change is gonna happen, you should be prepared to cope with it, because things are gonna change anyway. So you have the option to be prepared or not, right? Depending on, of course, also on your possibilities, not just on your awareness. And von Clausewitz writes, in the preparations for a great battle, it makes an essential difference whether it begins in the morning or the evening. It is true. Actually, the majority, especially the great battles he has addressed before, are really influenced by this. Like if you consider, I always come up with my examples that I'm currently studying now because I'm lost in 2 battles. I'm already 4 days late in my time schedule for my chapters, and I'm freaking out. But part of this is, looking at all these battles, and objectively, they all tend to end towards the end of the day, especially the largest ones, like the ones that have evidently they protract over time, right? Because battles are actually, this maybe has nothing to do with the time of day in itself, but von Clausewitz is pointing out that the length of great battles is a thing. They extend for several hours, so he's not just anecdotal about it. So battles are a long business because essentially they don't escalate like in a single clash where everybody gets butchered by one another and just the strongest survivors wins. Like battles are something extremely carefully operated. Like humans really don't want to die, and they try their best not to do it, right? So a lot of most of battles proper are not even about combat proper. They're about fighting for a couple of minutes, then going back and kind of restore, refreshing or treating your wounds, or however in the most average situation, just staying there and reloading your human batteries, because even just a couple of minutes of combat is something dreadful, right? You have to take it little doses, otherwise you're gonna and that's why also in fact defeats and when a formation breaks and routes and what ensues is normally pretty bloody. That's the overwhelming wave that arrives to crush all of this balance that during the battle it's up to the point it's not decided. It's still kind of an equilibrium between the two parties that are fighting, right? So battles are very long, and especially larger battles, of course. And larger battles also need a greater coordination. So what happens on the field is naturally there is more at stake than a normal engagement, and therefore everybody's more cautious. And since the troops that command are kind of more composite, and they can also interplay in a certain way to increase their effectiveness against the enemy, there's a great importance in also preserving them in certain situations from the same time, let's say light change, right? In the sense that, of course, most battles that last up to twilight are normally going to decrease in intensity, right? And normally the two sides are going to disengage by that time. The point is that if situation is particularly complex, instead you can get, I don't know, you get stuck in a city, for example, surrounded by enemy forces. What do? Night is gonna fall. The example, everybody, you have known about Mission Irene, Somalia, 1993. That they also made the movie Black Hawk Down. Well, it's a pretty good example of a situation in which things are gonna go worse, and you already know it, because the fight is gonna protract even during the night. And the ideal would be to take everybody out of there before, and instead it doesn't happen, and that overly complicates the situation further, right? And the main problem at that point is really this one, that in an optimal light you can't see things and coordinate better. When the darkness falls, you can't. So at that point there is the advantage that a trained, let's say, the better trained soldier has, or let's say the let's put it in a different matter. Let's say that there is going to be a side that is more advantaged than another, right? That advantage can be reduced in terms of of effective, I don't know how to say that, employability of your capacities, because at night it's as if there was the leveling of a situation that degenerates into less perception from the side of everyone, and this doesn't actually make the guy with a disadvantage kind of falling necessarily in kind of at a lower grade, but on the contrary can bring the side that has an advantage to a lower standard, because light can favor a lot those standards, right? So it's like when you fight out of formation, right? Troops have always been, in the history of warfare, have always been more effective when they were more collectively trained, right? When you take that guy out of that formation, well, the guy can be part, even of the best elite that in a single unit can do the best things, but if it's alone out there, it can be easily knocked out, even by guys that have a dramatically low, training and ability and individual value, that maybe in proportion in an open field in the same numbers would be destroyed, and instead in another particular type of situation, in that type of situation, they instead can reduce the disadvantage and taking the enemy out at that point, even if it's so good still at that point, maybe more individually than the single ones of them. So that is the great problem, that when the darkness falls, you have more problems with everything, with visibility, communication. You don't know where your troops are. At least it becomes more difficult to know it, right? And this happens dramatically often, right? Even with modern technology, we don't actually know at every single time what things are going to be. If you're talking about special forces, in surgical operations, of course, there is a dramatic coordination. Everybody knows exactly where every single guy is. If we were talking about a front line when hundreds of thousands of people are fighting all together, well, try at that point to have even to distribute even the technological means but especially the intelligence to make sense of what is happening on the battlefield. It's for an individual soldier that doesn't work. Of course, there is kind of a unit dimension. There's a hierarchy, there's a cohesion for which, of course, everybody is kind of responsible of its own subordinates, etc. So everybody has there is a way of units kind of sticking together even when the commands do not really know what is going on. But it's obvious that the command has to know, and sometimes it's very, very difficult to understand what is happening in the first place. And even with modern technology and in extremely surveilled, let's say, operations, we still don't know what is going on there. Nobody knows. No, we can't reconstruct every single thing that happens, and darkness or unfavorable light conditions in general, that is still darkness, but I mean not necessarily night, like at the time of the day, can really make that way more difficult, right? So, and there are other concerns, like in open ground as well. Participating in battles in open ground entails that you also have to bring with you certain amounts of supplies, for example, that have to be guarded, have to be defended. So visibility in terms of light, for example, during the day is crucial at that point, because we all know that at night, most of the time, attacks at camps, at fortified are pretty much obvious, because you don't know the entity of the enemy, right? This is typical. There are many battles that were also kind of influenced by the previous night attacks, and in conditions of surprise, which maybe the enemy who did this was in very small numbers, but it was enough to terrorize the attacked at the point that doesn't matter how they're numerically inferior, they could be overrun. They could overrun the enemy. I mean, and so all these factors that are obviously there. If you study battle after battle in the most diverse contexts of military history, you notice this quite clearly, that there is a continuity in this alternation of day and night in the way operations are dealt with, and this influences every single thing that happens in that point. That's why von Clausewitz includes these the time of the day as those factors that are always there, that you can't deal with like as if they didn't matter, right? Also because there is a provision, there is a predictability, right? The time of the day is predictable. It's one of the few predictable things. Weather is not. Weather is really not. Even the locality actually is not, because you can't say, yeah, I know this place on the map, but until you get there, you don't really understand it. The time of the day is you can't get it at the split second, and this is probably an important thing to think of, because in the planning phase, in the operational phase, it's let's say it really has a firm it's cyclical, right? There are certain dynamics that recur over and over and over and over again. Weather and terrain, of course, influence all the time, as much as time of the day, but they also vary a lot over time. Time of the day quite doesn't, right? Although, of course, when crossed with other factors, it's still something very pressing, right? The fact that day and night arrive always the same point is it's kind of useful, but at the same time, you know that you have certain limited options on that base, for which, if you really have to engage the enemy for several hours, you have to make it happen. Normally, in that specific time of the day, when you know that there is an advantage or not, if you want to exploit it, of course, then there can be other factors that will make you attack better at night, or maybe you're favored by the same darkness. It depends. It always depends. What I'm saying here are just examples you can throw there just to make you understand how the time of day effectively does influence, right? However, von Clausewitz also says something important, that is, at the same time, certainly many battles may be fought in which the question of the time of day is quite immaterial, and in the generality of cases its influence is only trifling. This is kind of the correction of many things we said, making relative examples, right? Saying, time of day, yes, it does have an influence, but as we were saying at the beginning of the video, this as a single factor, as a single variable, can be overwhelmed by many others that have nothing to do when you're considering that specific combat, maybe, with how things are gonna go, right? And von Clausewitz stresses that many battles actually are fought without much concern about the time of the day, and in the generality of cases, even more, he goes even further, its influence is only trifling. And this is objectively true, right? As I was saying before, of course, day and night can really influence a lot certain aspects, but once again, these are certain aspects, and there are lots of other aspects that make these appearing like kind of non-influent. At the point who cares, right? And so and there is in fact even a dimension of military history that should be and of warfare, that should be taken into consideration. It is, as we will see now, especially the tomorrow, not tomorrow, next time, with a paragraph on weather that is probably the shortest one in Vom Kriege. It's like these, let's say, terrain, time of the day, weather are important, are decisive in many cases, but at the same time, it's important to stress how the armed forces can get through that without many difficulties in many occasions, right? It's obvious that if you find a ridge, you don't have any way to go through that. Well, at that point, terrain is going to be a great problem. If you're chasing someone, at a distance with the aid of daylight and night falls, well, the time of the day is going to be very important at that point. If weather is like it's snowing like hell, you can't see anything. You fall into the snow every step you make. That is going to make a very important difference. But altogether, overall, on average, like armed forces go on anyway, even in the most extreme conditions, and therefore we shouldn't be sometimes so concerned about it after all. Like, of course, the more you descend into the particular detail, like at a kind of a soldier's level, that is going to make a great difference. If you take the whole system, say the whole army, and you see that objectively, yes, there are problems, you can observe how certain factors can have an impact in many cases as well. At the same time, you realize that it's as if these forces, in certain, say, that the range probably of normal situation kind of widens a lot, considering all the cases that can happen, right? It's obvious that if you follow that from a map, strategical map, looking at all the divisions and how they move, etc., it will appear as if they're just it looks like a video game, right? If you start seeing it, it's very simple, right? There's these things moving along the front in the fight, and they actually correspond to fairly simple dynamics, apparently, right? If you descend at the soldier's level, it's obvious that every single situation appears as radically different from the one of anybody else. So this naturally tells you the differences that exist between different levels of command and what they have to do, and the formation, let's say the training that these elements must have in order to work. And this is important because it's obvious that war, and we'll see it better from Clausewitz, is actually changing even for the slightest matter, right? But it's obvious that statistically speaking, there are certain things that kind of tend to go together most of the times, and that will make even a part of that theory of the art of war, in fact, that we are looking at the point that you can't tell whether that thing will actually happen before it happens, right, or not. But it's quite likely that it will, right? You don't have many doubts about the fact that, I don't know, a paratrooper unit will be deployed in a certain situation that will go on, etc. When it comes to whether you take the single paratrooper and you think about his landing and whether he will break his legs or not, or he will have other problems with his gear, etc. Well, that's a different matter, and probably at that point every paratrooper will tell you that things have gone slightly differently, but still enough to make you understand how things can vary a lot, right? So time of day, of course, does influence, sometimes a lot, but in most of the cases, actually, it doesn't have much of an influence, right? Even at night, and everybody fights. Like, there is not much of a. It's not surprising at this point. Go look at any documentary, even about recent conflict, and see how soldiers actually live during the time of the day, right? And modern warfare, in this sense, is probably, as we were saying before, is probably only apparently kind of more extended. Like, we think that warfare is somewhat now it's tougher. Well, it really depends. There are certain things for which, of course, there can be, let's say, that there can be a higher concentration of kind of devastating events in a single place compared to, I don't know, Bronze Age warfare. But it really depends. Really, in terms of night and day fighting, um, like it's always there. It's always the same thing, right? And it's also because soldiers also tend to reduce. It's not a matter of distance. Of you. I mean, what I'm trying to say is, you can't isolate a factor that at this point can be interpreted like the one that, with the time of combined with the time of the day, changed the thing in warfare. And that's why what I would like to make you understand here is the axiomatical perspective that you should have when you study warfare. That is, that warfare in this sense truly never changes. Like, there are things that, even though war is fought in kind of through different means, let's say, it at the end of the day, it always functions like this. And this is why von Clausewitz here is listing those factors that indeed, doesn't matter which kind of military historical context you're studying, they always made a difference, and they will keep to always make a difference, right? And of course you say, well, I don't know, we will go to fight into space. Well, yeah, but that still doesn't change actually what von Clausewitz is talking about in here. Meaning that even at that point, this alternation of light and darkness is actually a pretty important element overall to observe how that alternation works, and the fact that you're always going to be influenced as a human by these, by for example, by light or its absence, right? So that's it's particularly important. It's mostly what effect it makes on humans than what actually happens outside. So it's obvious that von Clausewitz couldn't think of a scenario in which, the day and night wouldn't make difference unless you was fighting, I don't know, into a closed space in a tunnel, whatever, I don't know. But that's not what matters in the way effectively war is practically waged, right? And this tells you, in its comprehensive dimension, and that's why he's so brilliant in his synthesis capability, because you can find all those extreme particular situations that will make a difference, but at that point is where are you going to have them realistically, and how instead and how much did that happen historically, because this is also really what we have to take into consideration. So it's obvious that even if you guys were fighting into space, this, I think, of time of day would still have an influence in terms of, in fact, of light and darkness in this sense. And that's where the aspect as such is going to influence generally how the combat is fought. But I'd say these paragraphs are still very, very short, so I'm kind of trying to lengthen them, and I don't want to fall in the trick of making them sound as if, in fact, there was so much to discuss about them. You just have to acknowledge what these statements are framed in, like in a theory, and the fact that literally every single scenario can be different, but there are elements that kind of recur very, very often, statistically speaking, and you have to bear in mind, right? So this is pretty much it. And next paragraph, I can't even tell you now, is on weather. Still more rarely has the weather any decisive influence. It is mostly only by fogs that it plays a part, right? This kind of statement is also very important. We will comment next time, but already from here you understand that, going back to what we were saying before, that after all, the way armed forces move in their natural element are somewhat very, like, they don't have such a huge they don't make such a huge impact in the way certain things are, and time of the day is one of them, right? Time of the day, yeah, it is important in certain specific cases, but overall doesn't. I mean, it's virtually influent, right? But once again, this is when you have to start struggling with the concept of non-positive theory of the art of war, right? Because if you interpret, because I'm sure that no matter how many times a person will read this, we will always make the same mistake of trying to make it an absolute. If anything, like I've done today, at least making certain relative examples, of course, like saying imagine this situation, but it's obviously a specific situation. It's a relative situation. It's not an absolute situation that happens all the times. So it's obvious that when von Clausewitz makes this statement that, I don't know, the time of day is not even a big deal most of the times, well, you shouldn't think it's literally not a big deal all the time. So sometimes it's really a big deal. And this is mostly evident, for example, in large battles, right? But overall, in let's say even large battles can be, first of all, somewhat, they can't go on, right? It depends also on how you define a battle, how long it lasts, for example. There's going to be an influence of time of day changing. Maybe if the battle lasts for okay, we will explain these things where we'll get actually to the point where von Clausewitz defines it. But most of the times people are going to fight no matter what at that point, right? So in terms of time and of day or night, this is what I wanted to stress. It sounds contradictory because it must leave always an option open to the eventuality that certain things happen and have an impact, because this is really how it happens. It's just that there is a frequency that has to be taken into consideration, and that frequency is not even calculable with the let's say by a numerical standard. Like, all you can measure in here is effectively how long the day and night last, obviously, but that's as far as it goes in terms of strict regulation, let's say, of what happens. Then how this reacts with the particular military situation, well, that leaves to be determined every single time. And most of the times it doesn't quite matter. In certain times it does matter, right? So that's simple as that. That's how you could sum up the whole concept, okay? Alright, so for now, let's stop it here. I just hope that you enjoyed this video. If you did, please share it. Otherwise, leave a like or subscribe to my channel if you're interested in my upcoming contents. And for now, I thank you heartily for listening to me. I wish you a nice time and see you next time. Bye.